A historic moment in Hanoi today. The United States formally dropped its prohibition on selling weapons to Vietnam. It highlighted the dramatic turnaround in relations between the two former enemies. John Yang has our report.
This change will ensure that Vietnam has access to the equipment it needs to defend itself, and it removes a lingering vestige of the Cold War.
In Hanoi, President Obama officially ended the more than 4 decades-old arms embargo.
At this stage, both sides have established a level of trust and cooperation, including between our militaries, that is reflective of common interests and mutual respect.
That mutual respect was on full display during the first of Mr. Obama's 3 days in Vietnam. He was greeted at the presidential palace by a military honor guard. At night, hundreds of people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the president as he left a noodle shop. The warming extends to commerce, too. American and Vietnamese companies signed deals worth $16 billion. Lifting the arms embargo reflects growing U.S. concerns about China's military buildup and territorial ambitions in the South China Sea. China's efforts to exert more naval control over shipping lanes in the sea is troubling to both the United States and Vietnam. While acknowledging the shared concerns, Mr. Obama said ending the embargo was about warming relations between two former foes.
The decision to lift the ban was not based on China or any other considerations. It was based on our desire to complete what has been a lengthy process of moving towards normalization with Vietnam.
China's immediate response was muted, but human rights groups said Vietnam was getting a reward it didn't deserve. They've long criticized Vietnam's communist regime for repressing dissidents. Even as he praised the two nations' reconciliation, President Obama underscored differences over democracy and human rights. Tomorrow, he meets with Vietnamese dissidents. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm John Yang.
We'll focus on the phenomenon of Vietnamese Americans returning home later in the program.
In Iraq, government troops have launched a much-anticipated offensive to retake Fallujah from Islamic State fighters. The city, about 40 miles west of Baghdad, has been under the militant group's control since January 2014. Today, Iraqi forces pushed their way into nearby farming areas. They were backed by U.S. coalition airstrikes and paramilitary troops.
Islamic State bombings in Syria killed nearly 150 people today and wounded at least 200 more. 5 suicide attackers and 2 car bombs hit government strongholds in the coastal cities of Jabla and Tartus. That area is home to Russian military bases. ISIS also claimed responsibility for twin bombings in Yemen that killed at least 45 people there. The victims had gathered at army recruiting centers in Aden.
The leader of an anti-immigrant party in Austria came within a whisker today of being elected president. His support showcased rising opposition, both to migrants and to the European Union. James Mates of Independent Television News reports.
Austria held its breath. Much of Europe held its breath. The country's interior minister walked solemnly to the podium to declare whether the far right here have made the biggest electoral breakthrough since World War II.
Alexander van der Bellen entfallen 2.254.000.
By just 31,000 votes out of 4.5 million, Norbert Hofer of the Freedom Party had been kept out of the presidential palace, conceding defeat on his Facebook page, but promising his supporters he'll be back. The country's new president is the mild-mannered economics professor Alexander van der Bellen, backed originally by the Greens, but then by everybody as they tried to keep the far right out. So Europe will breathe a sigh of relief, but cannot ignore the biggest lesson here: the collapse of the centre and the rise of the extremes of both left and right. Centrist politicians who face wipeout point out it's far from just an Austrian problem.
Should the rest of Europe be worried about this?
I think the entire Europe should worry about what is going on in entire Europe without specifically looking into in one country. It's not that what is going on in Austria is so much different from what is going on in very many other European countries.
At a party in a Vienna beer garden last night, Norbert Hofer was prematurely celebrating victory. But 49.7% of the vote is hardly a defeat.
Center-left parties have dominated Austrian politics since World War II, but they were eliminated in last month's first round of voting.
Back in this country, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the murder conviction for a death row inmate in Georgia because of racial bias in picking his jury. Timothy Foster was convicted in 1987 of murdering an elderly white woman. The High Court ruled 7-1 that state prosecutors violated the Constitution when they excluded blacks from his jury. Foster is now eligible for a new trial.
A Baltimore policeman was acquitted today in the death of Freddie Gray, an incident that sparked riots in the city last year. A judge found Officer Edward Nero had little to do with Gray's arrest and death in custody. Nero still faces an internal police investigation. In all, 6 officers were charged in the case. The trial of the first ended in a hung jury. We'll examine the verdict and its implications later in the program.
A major takeover bid today in the farm chemicals industry. Germany's Bayer offered to buy Monsanto for $62 billion. The St. Louis seed giant specializes in crop seeds and the widely used weed killer Roundup. Any deal would be subject to a federal regulatory review of how it affects farmers and consumers.
On Wall Street, a quiet day. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 8 points to close below 17,493. The Nasdaq fell 3 points, and the S&P 500 slipped 4.
And swarms of insects are now threatening the Taj Mahal in India. Millions of flies are breeding in a polluted river that's nearby, and they're leaving behind green and black waste. That's forced crews to scrub the 17th century monument every day. Officials warn all that scrubbing will damage the building's famed marble inlay work.